Three, two, one. Hey, shagheads, buzzheads, zoinkers, all you people out there. It is Curtis Tucker, aka Shags, here with another episode of the Curtis Tucker Podcast. I am here sitting in Shaggy Duck Studio, located in Enid, Oklahoma. I appreciate all you guys checking in. If you're new and you just happen to accidentally run across the podcast, I appreciate you listening. If you are just listening on a podcasting platform, I do have a video version where I wave at you and say hello over on the youtube.com Curtis Tucker channel. So you can head on over there and find that. Please subscribe to the podcast and to the YouTube channel and give me some feedback. I love to hear from you guys. Appreciate the numbers are going up for the number of people listening. You can hit me up at curtistucker.com or shags@shaggyduck.com. Either one of those. And I would love to hear comments on prior episodes, episode ideas, things that you would like to hear, wouldn't like to hear, guests that you'd like to me get on the show. Now, that's one thing I haven't done in a while is get a guest on the show. So I am going to try to find some guests to get on here. I think I'm going to start using a kind of a different video system where if I have a guest, we can split the screen and have me and somebody else on at the same time. So look for that in the very near future. Don't forget, there is also a companion blog post to all of the podcast episodes, and that is at curtistucker.com. So if you go to curtistucker.com, you can click on the blog post. It'll be in written form, and then at the bottom will be this audio podcast embedded, and then this video embedded underneath that. So everything all in one place, a lot easier to find everything there. And you can also leave comments there on the blog. So I appreciate you guys stopping by there as well. So tonight's episode was, I thought about it because there's kind of a viral trend going around right now, especially on TikTok and Instagram. And what it is they'll have somebody on there. It seems like lately it's mostly guys, and they'll say, you know, hey, my kid asked me what it was like in the 90s or what I was like in the 90s. And then they'll do a cycle through photos and fade them in from one photo of themselves in the 90s through the next. And so basically just showing kind of what they look like and what they were doing in the 90s. And then I've seen some towns do the same thing, and they'll say like, what was this town like in the 80s? And it's not necessarily everyone doing the 90s. I think it started as a viral trend for the 90s. I definitely don't want to do one for the 90s. So I actually did one for the 80s. Probably should do one. I've kind of probably done one for the 70s, but probably need to do another one for the 70s. But anyway, that got me thinking, you know, what was I like in the 90s? And I got to thinking, well, you know, all of my decades of life have been really divided. I mean, almost clear-cut divided into different, I was in definitely different stages through almost every decade. And so I thought, well, this would be a good podcast. I'll run through all of my decades, and number one, it'll be a reminder for me. So, you know, when I turn 92, I'll be able to listen to it and remember things that maybe I have forgotten. Also, an episode that my girls could always go back and listen to, because I know there's some things I would like to ask my mom, grandma, and great-grandma of things that I'm doing, and there's just nobody left to ask those questions to. I wish I had asked a whole bunch of more questions. So if you are young and you happen to be watching this video or listening to the podcast, ask a lot of questions. Ask your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents. Ask them where they lived. Ask them what jobs they had. Ask them why they moved to where they were, you know, things like that. Just try to get all that history. And I know it's getting a little easier now because we have so many videos and photos and social media. So people are keeping track of their lives on social media and stuff. But, you know, for somebody like the Generation Jones and the baby boomers, we don't have all of that history going back all the way to the 60s, 70s, 80s, even 90s. So I'm going to give you a little bit. I won't go into super detail. I'm not going to tell you everything I did of every decade, but I'm going to basically tell you what defined the decades for me, and you'll kind of see that each decade was defined, pretty good for me. So I am 63, which puts me at being born in 1962. So I was a baby child of the 60s, born in 62. My mom was from Enid, Oklahoma, married an Air Force airman, and they got stationed on different bases, and I just happened to be born on a military base in San Antonio, Fort Sam Houston, Texas. And then we traveled around and ended up in Turkey. And so my toddler life was spent over in Turkey, and we lived, I'm not sure if we were actually living, I think we were probably living on the Air Force base, if not like right outside the Air Force base. But, and I don't again, I should have asked my mom all these questions. I don't know the exact number of years. I'm guessing between 2 and 3 years we lived there, and then we moved back to the States, and for some reason ended up back in Oklahoma, but we ended up down in Burns Flat, Oklahoma at, now I'm going to forget the name of the base down there. But anyway, it was in Burns Flat. And then, unfortunately, my parents got divorced in 69, somewhere around there. My mom, being from Enid, moved us back to Enid in 1969. I had gone to kindergarten in Burns Flat and then got moved up here in 69, 70. So, the 60s was definitely defined by childhood. So not a huge amount of memories. I mean, I do have memories of the 60s, but just not enough to define the 60s other than I was a kid. So then we get into the 70s and basically starting first grade and then going all the way through junior high and high school and graduating high school in 1981. So basically the 70s for me was entirely school, being a teenager, adolescent, all that stuff. And so, and that was entirely in Enid. Grew up entirely in the 70s in Enid, Oklahoma, entirely went to Enid schools. So, and, being a kid and being carefree and all that stuff. I mean, my favorite decade by a mile is the 70s. And I think you guys, if you know me at all, or if you've listened to some of my stuff, you guys know that, because I do co-host the 70s Buzz podcast, where we talk about growing up in the 70s because it was so cool. So I started out when we first moved to Enid. My mom just got a house that was, I think, close to, well, first when we moved back to Enid, we lived with my grandma for a couple of months. And then my mom got a job at the First United Methodist Church. And so we rented a house over there for just not very long. I don't even know if it was 6 months, but then I think she got a job out at the base, and there was a house for rent across from my great grandma. So we moved over to South Johnson, and that gave my mom a chance. She didn't have to pay for childcare or babysitting, what we called it back then. So my sister and I were latchkey kids, where we would come home from school and stay by ourselves in the house. But my great grandma lived across the street in case we needed anything. And she, being an old person, would sit in her rocking chair in her front window and stare at our house all day. And if she saw kids coming or going, the phone would ring and we were told to send them home. So I went to, when we first moved to that first rent house, I went to Lincoln. At that time, Lincoln was an elementary school. So I went there for part of first grade. Then we moved over to McKinley, and then I went from the rest of McKinley all the way through sixth grade at McKinley. within that time span is when I met Staten, the summer of 74. We were in sixth grade together. Brendan was in our sixth grade class. He was one of the five that was a part of our gang on West Broadway. And then, so sixth grade, seventh grade, eighth grade was all defined by us five running around doing all kinds of fun stuff on West Broadway. And that was like my prime, funnest time ever. And then towards the end of junior high, we kind of started. Brendan had moved by then, and then the two other guys that we ran around with on West Broadway, they were actually 2 years younger than us. So there was like a 2 year span between when we went to junior high before they came to junior high, and then once they got there, we were getting ready to go up to high school. And by then we just weren't hanging out as much, and so that's when we met Todd and started thinking about forming the band. Then we got into high school in 78, and then really started hanging around Staten, Todd, and I from then on. Then went on to Enid High School in 70, the second half of 78, and met Alan and Kyle and formed our band. And so that kind of defined the end of the 80s. But so that was basically the 70s. It was all kid stuff, running around Enid, no worries, not driving, banana seat bikes. I mean, I guess we did start driving at the very end of the 70s, but just barely. So most of it was skateboards and bicycles and fun stuff like that. Then the 80s came along, and the 80s, the 80s was, college-wise, was a blast, but so the 80s was pretty much defined for me, by college, because I went to college for 5 years rather than 4. So it was defined by college and then finding a job. That was most of the 80s. So we were out of high school and pretty much out of Enid by 1981. I went to Northern Oklahoma College up in Tonkawa, junior college, went to 2 years up there, and lived in Markley Hall. So Kyle, the drummer from our band, he and I both went up there and roomed together the 2 years that we were up there, and met some new friends. Met Brian Engelking from up in Newkirk, and he had also lived in Canada. And so he was a little bit older than us, but he and I started running around together. I dated Brenda while I was there for a year, and then graduated from Northern Oklahoma College in 1983. Wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, but decided to go to Stillwater, to Oklahoma State University, because pretty much all of the guys that I was running around with were going there. And so Brian and Donnie and we all lived in Markley Hall. We got a house on Airport Road in Stillwater, and I changed my major from basically kind of arts to psychology. Took psychology classes for a semester, partied a lot, wasted a whole semester, changed it back to art. But because I was behind on enrolling, had missed the first semester, I didn't qualify for a lot of the second semester art classes. So I had to take a bunch of weird, like ancient Chinese religion, weird classes. But that pretty much wiped out all of the weird extra classes that I was ever going to need. So even though nothing really went towards a degree or what I do today, at least I got a bunch of classes out of the way. Lived there for a year and left there in 84. And then 84 was and when I lived in Stillwater for that year, I worked for the university at the football stadium. So I got to hang out and watch Jimmy Johnson and Pat Jones and the Oklahoma State Cowboys practice, and helped move equipment and did all that stuff there. And then I went down and lived with Staten the summer after Stillwater. And I just started dating a girl named Beth but we'd only gone out like once or twice. And then I got down to Texas and ran around with those guys, spent the whole summer down there we started working for a door factory. We only lasted about a week and a half and quit. And then Staten's dad gave us a job working around the ranch. So we worked on the ranch all summer in 1984. It was in Yorktown. And then at the end of the summer, I decided I had been asking some people, where was the best like art graphic design school in Oklahoma, and everybody said it was at it was called the University of Central Oklahoma at the time. No, it was called Central State University at the time. And so I enrolled there, came back up to Oklahoma, moved in with another buddy from high school, Steve Voss. He and I roomed in a dorm in Edmond. And so I started going to school there, and basically I got to take all art classes for 2 years. I never left the art building. I never had any class other than in the art building for 2 years because I'd gotten all those other classes out of the way. So that was kind of fun. And then almost immediately, once I got there, I started dating a different girl and had to break up with the other girl, and then basically ended up spending most of my time at her apartment. So I never really did see Steve Voss very much. I would pop in every now and then. And so dated her all the way through graduation, graduated from Central State in 1986, and didn't really see any jobs, any prospects at the time. So I moved down with Staten. He was going to school at North Texas State University and living in an apartment. So I went down and lived with him for a couple of weeks and looked for a job in the Dallas area and couldn't really find anything. I was trying to find something specifically in my field. Now I could have got a job doing just anything, but so didn't find a job. So I moved back to Enid, and had a job in Enid just to get me some money living with my mom. And then I decided I didn't want to live with my mom and in Enid. So then I got a job at a silk screening plant in Oklahoma City. And the only way I could afford to move back and live in Oklahoma City was to rent a room from a guy named Ray who had a house in Edmond, and he was basically renting out a bedroom. So like I just had a bedroom, then I had to share the bathroom and kitchen and living room with him and his sometimes girlfriend. And but anyway, that got me out of the house and down into the whole Oklahoma City area. And then and so the whole time that I was doing that, I barely had any money, and I was taking peanut butter and jelly literally to work every day. Kind of starving, didn't have much money to do many things anyway. But then I got another job at Scrivener where I was doing signs, and then worked my way into the layout department, which meant more money. And then I moved out of Ray's house into an apartment, which was the apartment complex that my girlfriend at the time was living in. And so we were both living in the apartment complex, but we were kind of on again, off again. And then we were off. And then I met a new girl at that new job. And so we started dating, and that was kind of how the 80s was about to end. And then in 89, that girl and I decided to get married, and they kind of had a policy where you both couldn't work in the same department if you were married. So I started looking for a new job. I was looking in the paper at Oklahoma City jobs and just happened to find one in Enid. So in 1989, so basically the 80s were pretty much over. And again, the 80s defined me as college and trying to find a job. And so in 89, got married, started working for Evans, and moved to Enid all in 1989. And then the 90s came along. And so the 90s, was fun, but at times, but miserable at times. And it was basically defined by a first marriage, was a stepdad to a son, and always living on a budget, just trying to make it through life. So not a super thrilling decade for me, but I did start officially my side job, my graphic design business. That's when I really got it started. So when I started using Macintosh computers, finally ended up buying my first house in the 90s. It was a house at the corner of Park and Johnson, a big, huge 2-story house. Still hung out with a lot of the people that I'd worked with in Oklahoma City at Scrivener. We would go down there to parties. They would come up here to parties. And then I sold that house, moved into a smaller house, bought a Corvette. I had Jeeps for most of the 90s, and then got a wild hair and decided to sell my last Jeep, a 84 CJ7, and bought a 1974 Corvette convertible red. So that was kind of cool. And then moved again and moved to a house on West Cherokee. And then that's when things were really starting to come unglued. My wife had started a home business of doing childcare. And so she was always there. We were always arguing. I had started working out. That's when I had started going to the gym. And so I was working out really heavy. I wasn't as much into aerobics and walking and running like I am now, but that's basically the 90s is when I started the whole workout thing. And then ended up in around 96 getting a divorce and having to sell the house on West Cherokee, but I hadn't sold it yet. And then asked Denise out, and this was like a year. This was in 97. So spent a year just kind of goofing around, trying to survive in the house. I had Connie, my sister's ex-husband, moved in with me, was paying me some rent, but I couldn't keep the house. I had it on the market trying to sell it. And then he moved out, and then we sold the house, and I moved out. And I think I lived with Connie for a couple of weeks, and then I lived in an apartment for a couple of weeks. I lived in Jim and Betty's guest house for a couple of weeks, and had asked Denise to get married in 97, and we had a date in July of 98. So I was just basically trying to find places to live until we got married. And then she was going to school in Oklahoma City to get her dental hygiene license. And we'd both been kind of commuting back and forth, and I was still the advertising director at Evans Drug. And then we got married in July of 98. And then I just moved down to Oklahoma City in the apartment with her. And then I commuted every day. And then she got out of school in the late 90s, and we moved back to Enid, got a rent house for a couple of rent houses, and then we bought a house in the 2000s. So we rented a house in Enid out in Cedar Ridge, and didn't really like that, so we moved out of that. And then Jim and Betty had bought a house on Adolpha, so we moved into that for a while. And then Piper came along, and so then the 2000s started. So the 90s was basically defined by first marriage, working as the advertising director at Evans Drug the entire decade, but learning a bunch of stuff on the computer at the end of the 90s. So throughout the late 90s, I had kind of messed with AOL, but didn't really understand what the internet was. And then in 99, built my first website, started Cartoons, and then that's when basically the 2000s was when my own business really took off, when I had kids. So the 2000s was pretty fun because I had two daughters and I was working from home and the job was going great and I was discovering all kinds of new stuff online and how to make money online. So then we eventually, Denise had gotten a job in Cherokee and she was commuting back and forth from Cherokee. And so I had been taking the girls to work with me at Evans and just decided that I was able to make enough money that I quit Evans, started working from home, and had Piper in 2002, Cheney in 2003. Then we bought the house on Seneca, which is here in Indian Hills. And I started Shaggy Duck Studio full, pretty much full time, and got the cartoons logo business going, was building all kinds of websites and blogs, and basically working from home. And then in 2005 started the blog about Enid called Enid Buzz. And then Denise quit in Cherokee and started working for a whole bunch of dentists in Enid. So then we were back here raising the girls. We decided to send them to Montessori school. And so for the first few years of their education, they went to Cimarron Montessori School. And then at one point we decided to move them to public school, but they wouldn't let Cheney into first grade because she missed the cutoff by 5 days. So we decided to leave the girls in Montessori for an extra year. And then the next year, Cheney was in second grade. Well, they probably would have wanted to put her in first grade, but we bumped her up to second grade. And so she, from then on out, she was only a year behind Piper and always the youngest in her class. But, and then they also started dance, just regular dance. So there was, a lot of dance lessons and recitals, some tennis in there, some soccer in there. Our first trip to Disney and to Marco Island was in there. So the 2000s was fun. Kids growing up, I got to stay home, be a stay-at-home dad, took the girls to school every day, picked them up every day, took them to lunch a lot of the times. And it was just a real fun time. And actually, and so we lived over there on Seneca. So then the 2010s came along, and I'm going to sneeze. Hang on. Excuse me. Okay, so 2010s came along. About that time, we got an offer to buy this house the first time that we lived here. So basically, the first time that we moved into this house that I'm filming right now, this was an outdoor patio with no walls. There was just a ceiling fan and a barbecue grill right here where I'm sitting. So we moved here, sold the house on Seneca, got the girls in public school. I started taking them to school every day. Then they started competitive dance. And so the 2010s were defined by me continuing to work for myself, but the girls were heavy into dance. And then in 2012, there was the big algorithm change with Google called the Panda Update, which killed the entire business that I'd been doing through the 2000s. And so in 2013, I had to decide, did I want to go back and start working for somebody again or try to come up with a new job? And so I had been working for myself for 10 years at that point, and I did not want to go work for somebody. So in 2013 was the year that I started Enid Buzz full time. It was the decade that we started going to Granbury. Staten and Michelle had bought a house, a lake house in Granbury, so we started going down there. And then eventually, midway through the 2010s, that's when they built the Enid Walking Trail. And so I started on the trail around 2015. Haven't stopped since. So I've been doing the trail every morning, for over 10 years now. And then we ended up, the girls had gotten old enough they wanted their own bedrooms, and I had had an office in the house and a bedroom, so we decided to sell the house to Jim and Betty, and then we moved to the Woodlands. And so lived in the Woodlands the second half of the 2010s. The girls were competing, it seemed like every weekend. They were practicing almost every night, so I was having meals by myself because Denise was hanging out there. So that's when Todd and I decided to start podcasting. That's when I got an office downtown and tried that out. We started the 70s Buzz podcast and Buzzhead Radio. Had an office in the Broadway Tower on the first floor for a while, maybe 6 months, and we moved to the Triangle Business Center or building up like on the 8th floor or 10th floor or somewhere up there. Then we eventually moved down to the bottom floor, opened up. What are you doing, buddy? Hang on. Okay, everybody, there was a little pause in there. My faithful companion decided to come outside and hang out with me, which is a little bit weird. He doesn't usually do that at night. He usually stays inside. So if you're watching the video, this is Mr. Saucy Pants, a.k.a. Graham. There's a big yawn. I think he came out to take a nap. So that was why I had to pause the video real quick. So I'm going to put him down and finish where I was. Okay, buddy. You going to lay down? Oh, I didn't get any water. Rats. Anyway, I was basically on the 2010s. Uh-oh. Am I out of water, buddy? Hang on. I think I'm out of water for him. I'll get you some water here in a little while. So ended up moving to the Woodlands and walked a different trail, but I stayed on the trail. And then eventually I started driving over and continued on the trail here. I had gotten offices. Oh, we started the retail store, the Bottle Caps Mercantile, and started printing our own T-shirts and sold those there. And we did that for a year, and it was such an odd, weird location. And I wasn't spending any time there in the office, so I decided to shut that down, move my office back home. We stopped printing T-shirts. And so basically that was the 2010s for me, which was fun, doing my own business and watching the girls compete, going to Branson and Tulsa and Oklahoma City and all that stuff. So that was fun. And then, and right at the end of the 2010s, so I'm doing Enabuzz full time through the end of the teens. And had gotten what I called the Buzzmobile, was driving that. It was a Chevy SUV, can't think of, Equinox. And then basically right at the beginning of the 2020s, had a guy pull out in front of me, crashed that, and bought another Jeep, which is my 2013 Jeep, which I'm still driving now. So I got to go get back into a Jeep, which was really fun. Then, of course, in the 2020s, COVID hit, which was not fun because it timed right when Piper was graduating from high school. She graduated valedictorian, and it kind of really screwed up that whole deal. It also screwed up her first year in college. It screwed up Cheney's senior year. The whole masking thing, it was a total fiasco. But Piper did graduate in 2020, went off to OU, made the pom team. We would go to football games and have to wear a mask and sit 6 seats from everybody around us. So there was looked like 2,000 people in the stadium, and the girls had to wear masks. It was ridiculous. But we made it through. Cheney graduated 2021, decided to go to Arkansas. She made the pom team there. And so, unfortunately, in the 2020s, Jim Evans passed away and my mom passed away. Betty had passed away in the teens. So that was not fun. But then because Jim had passed away, we decided to sell the Woodlands house and move back to this house. So we moved back into this house, and then Todd built this office for me, the new studio. So we moved back over here. But the 2020s, we're already halfway through it. But the first half of the 2020s was defined by college for the girls. So basically, because they were in Palm, they palmed at every home football game and basketball and some baseball. And so we spent 4 full years basically driving almost every other weekend, sometimes every weekend, to football games. So we had season tickets to the Arkansas Razorbacks, season tickets to the Oklahoma Sooners. One weekend we tried to keep it even. So one weekend we'd be in Arkansas at Fayetteville. The next weekend we go to Norman. The next weekend back to Fayetteville. And that's how it went for 4 years. And then there was even one weekend, I think it was homecoming weekend for one or both of them, but there was a Arkansas morning game and an OU afternoon game, or actually evening game. So we were able to go to the Arkansas game, leave just a few minutes early, drive to Norman, and made it for the kickoff of the OU game. So saw both games in one day. So that was fun, and then started spending more time going to Norman. Cheney didn't finish her last year of college, so basically both girls moved back home at the same time. So part of the 2020s has been having the girls living back at home, which has been fun. Both of them got jobs. They're both working. So, and I've been out here in the studio, turned part of this into a podcast studio like I'm doing right now. And so basically that's where we are right now. So that kind of, not a whole bunch of detail, but if I forget or anybody forgets, that's kind of what how the decades were defined for me. You guys start thinking about, for me, it was almost exactly, one decade to the next. It wasn't like, I was like halfway in one and halfway in the other, strangely. It was just timing. And so for me, definitely the 70s was the funnest, the most carefree. I think, I'm sure it wasn't as fun as I think it was, but man, it sure seemed like it was. And then probably the 2000s or the 2010s or even the 2020s is probably the thing about the 2000s, the 2010s, and the 2020s. Now, the 2020s are defined for me. It's 2000 and 2010s are all a blur. It's kind of like if you ask me something like what show or what event or what song, I don't really know. And I wasn't really into a whole bunch of music in the 90s, 2000s, 2010s. I was raising girls and working, creating my own stuff. But those 3 decades are kind of blurred together because they were all, it was just different stages of the girls, but I was still just a parent through all of that. So now the 2020s is definitely defined because it was chasing the girls, at college, which, basically started in 2020. So that's defined. Probably the least fun was the 90s, although I'm probably within the last 5 years, I've discovered a lot of the 90s music that I somehow missed. And I, really like some of the 90s music. Not a super fan of a lot of the 2000s and 2010 music. Some, not all, but, and then probably the next, would be the 80s. I mean, the 80s was fun. We thought about doing the 80s Buzz podcast, and we did a few episodes, and I think I'm at a better point right now where it might be funner to do that. But at the time that I was thinking about the 70s Buzz podcast, I was in that 70s mode. everything was happy and fun and carefree, and us five, one group were together, and then it went immediately to a different group. Whereas the 80s just seemed like it was, getting through school, getting through college, trying to find a job. But now that I think back on it, it was a lot of fun and partying and hanging out with guys and dating girls. And even though at the time it was a struggle and seemed, I see all these people now on Twitter and saying how they can't make it and they don't make enough money, nobody pays them enough. Well, we went through that too. I don't care what you guys say. I was eating peanut butter and jelly every day, just trying to survive and pay my bills. So it can be done. Nobody seems to want to sacrifice today. A lot of snowflakes today. But, so even though at the time it was a struggle finding jobs and trying to have enough money to just go out and get a beer, looking back on it now, it's probably been, it's been 5 to 8 years since I can't remember when last time we did an 80s Buzz podcast, but anyway, so that defines all of the decades for me. If you guys have any questions, let me know. Let me know what decade was your favorite, no matter how old you are. And depending on which decade it was, let me know why. Why was that decade the best one for you? So appreciate you guys. Hit me up at curtis@curtistucker.com, shags@shaggyduck.com. Please subscribe to the podcast, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Go to curtistucker.com and read some of my older blogs. And I think, did I mention this before? I'm going to mention it again. I do have a new podcast and kind of side business going called Okie Buzz. So if you guys live in Oklahoma, you want to know what's going on entertainment wise, I'm going to get that going full fledged, but subscribe to Okie Buzz. And then I've also got Enid Eclipse started going. I've got some t-shirt designs. I just need to get them on all of the t-shirts. And that is basically trying to get people ready for the 2045 solar eclipse here in Enid, Oklahoma, which is in the path of totality. So that'll be my third eclipse. I'll be 82 years old, but I plan on being here and watching it. So follow Enid Eclipse. I will have enideclipse.com up pretty soon as well. So those are all my side things going on. Don't forget to listen to the 70s Buzz podcast, Buzzhead Radio, and appreciate you guys. And I'm going to get out of here. See ya.